Welcome to Midnight Murmur. Here, the night comes alive with chilling tales and spine-tingling stories. If you crave the thrill of the unknown and the eerie whisper of the supernatural, you've found your new haunt. Join us as we dive into the darkest corners of the human mind, unraveling short horror stories that will keep you up at night. Hit that subscribe button, turn off the lights, and let the murmur begin. The Harrow House Chronicles. Chapter 1. The Arrival. It was a crisp autumn evening when David, Laura, Mike, and Emily arrived at Harrow House. The old mansion stood at the edge of town, shrouded in an aura of mystery and foreboding. Legend had it that the house was cursed, abandoned for decades after a series of tragic events. But they were determined to investigate the place, drawn by the allure of uncovering its dark secrets. David, the unofficial leader of the group, pushed open the rusted gate. "Come on, let's see what we can find," he said, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. The front door creaked open, revealing a grand foyer covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was oppressive. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "This place gives me the creeps." "It's just an old house," Laura said, trying to sound confident. "We'll be fine." Mike nodded, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "Let's stick together and see what's inside." Chapter 2. Exploring the house. The group split up to cover more ground, agreeing to meet back in the foyer in an hour. David and Laura took the left wing, while Mike and Emily headed right. David and Laura explored the dusty, decaying rooms. They found old furniture covered in sheets, faded portraits on the walls, and bookshelves filled with moldy, unreadable tomes. "This place is a time capsule," David said, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "It's like the people just vanished." Laura nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "It's creepy, but kind of fascinating." Meanwhile, Mike and Emily ventured into the kitchen and dining area. The long, dark dining table was set for a feast that had never been eaten, the plates covered in a thick layer of dust. "Look at this," Mike said, pointing to an old, tattered photograph on the wall. It showed a family, their faces solemn and eyes hollow. "I wonder what happened to them." Emily shivered. "Let's not stay here too long. This place gives me the chills." Chapter 3. The First Encounter. As they regrouped in the foyer, Laura noticed a faint light coming from the basement door. "Did anyone go down there?" she asked. "No," David said, frowning. "Let's check it out." They descended the creaky stairs, their flashlights flickering. The basement was filled with old, rusted machinery and stacks of rotting wood. In the corner, they found a small, locked door. "What's behind there?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. David tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "We need to find a key." As they searched the basement, Mike suddenly felt a cold hand brush against his arm. He jumped, his flashlight dropping to the ground. "What was that?" he exclaimed, his heart racing. "I didn't see anything," Laura said, though her face was pale. "Let's find the key and get out of here." Chapter 4. The Diary. Back in the main part of the house, they discovered a dusty old library. Emily began rifling through the books and papers, hoping to find some clue about the house's history. "Hey, look at this," she said, pulling out an old leather-bound diary. "It's a journal." They gathered around as Emily opened the diary. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, detailing the life of Elizabeth Harrow, the last known resident of the house. "Dear Diary," Emily reads aloud. "The whispers have started again. I can hear them in the walls, calling to me. I fear the darkness is growing stronger." "What do you think it means?" Mike asked, his voice filled with unease. "I don't know," David said, frowning. "But we need to find out." Chapter 5. The Hidden Room. Following clues from the diary, they discovered a hidden door behind a bookshelf in the library. The door led to a narrow, winding staircase that descended deep into the bowels of the house. The air grew colder as they descended, the light from their flashlights barely penetrating the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small, dimly lit room filled with strange, occult symbols. "This must be where Elizabeth performed her rituals," Laura said, her voice shaking. The walls were covered in cryptic symbols, and a large, ornate mirror stood in the center of the room. As they approached, the whispers began, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. "Can you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," David said, his face pale. "It's the whispers from the diary." Suddenly, the mirror began to glow, and a ghostly figure appeared within its depths. The figure's eyes were hollow, its mouth moving in a silent scream. Chapter 6. The Ghostly Warning. The ghostly figure in the mirror began to speak, its voice a soft, chilling whisper that echoed through the room. "Leave this place," it said. "The darkness will consume you." Emily stepped back, her heart pounding. "We need to go, now." David shook his head, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "Wait, we need to understand what happened here." The ghost's eyes locked onto David's, and a flood of images filled his mind. He saw Elizabeth Harrow, desperate and terrified, performing dark rituals to protect her family from an unseen force. But something had gone wrong, and the darkness had consumed them all. "We have to find a way to stop this," David said, his voice filled with determination. Chapter 7. The First Attack. As they left the hidden room, the air grew colder and the whispers grew louder. Shadows danced on the walls, and an oppressive sense of dread filled the house. In the foyer, Mike suddenly let out a scream. He was standing by the staircase, his face contorted in pain. Deep, bloody scratches appeared on his arms and chest, as if invisible claws were raking his skin. "Help me," Mike cried, his voice filled with terror. David and Laura rushed to his side, but it was as if an unseen force was holding him in place. Blood flowed freely from the wounds, soaking his shirt and pooling on the floor. "Let him go," David shouted, his voice echoing through the house. With a final, agonized cry, Mike collapsed to the floor, the invisible attack ceasing as abruptly as it had begun. They gathered around him, trying to stem the flow of blood with their jackets. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay in this house." Chapter 8. The Escape Attempt. Desperation set in as they tried to find a way out of the house. Every door they tried was locked, every window sealed shut. The whispers followed them wherever they went, growing louder and more insistent. "There's no way out," Laura said, her voice filled with panic. "We're trapped." David tried to stay calm. "We need to find another way. There has to be a secret exit somewhere." They split up again, hoping to cover more ground. As they searched the house, the strange occurrences began to escalate. Shadows moved on their own, disembodied voices echoed through the halls, and blood seeped from the walls. In the attic, David found a small, dusty window that looked like it might open. He pushed and pulled, but it remained stubbornly shut. Frustrated, he punched the wall, only to feel it give way under his fist. "Guys, I found something," he called out. The others rushed to his side, and together they managed to pry open the hidden door in the wall. Behind it was a narrow passage that led outside. "We did it," Laura said, her voice filled with relief. "We found a way out." Chapter 9. Night Terrors. They decided to camp in the nearby woods for the night, hoping to put some distance between themselves and the house. They set up their tents and tried to get some rest, but sleep was elusive. David was plagued by nightmares, visions of Elizabeth Harrow, and the dark rituals she had performed. He saw her standing in the hidden room, chanting incantations and drawing strange symbols on the walls. The whispers filled his ears, growing louder and more insistent. He woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. The others were awake too, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. "I can't take much more of this," Emily said, her voice trembling. "It's like they're inside my head." "We need to stay strong," David said, though he was shaking too. "We'll figure this out." As they tried to settle down for the night, each of them experienced terrifying visions and nightmares. Mike saw shadows moving in the corners of his eyes, ghostly figures that vanished when he tried to look at them directly. Laura felt cold hands touching her in the darkness, their grip like ice. Emily heard voices calling her name, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. Chapter 10: The Sacrifice. Morning light filtered through the trees, offering a brief respite from the oppressive darkness. They gathered around the campfire, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. David opened Elizabeth's diary again, hoping to find some clue that would help them. As he flipped through the pages, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A new entry, written in fresh blood, had appeared on the last page. "It's a message," he said, his voice trembling. "From Elizabeth." "What does it say?" Emily asked, her voice filled with dread. David reads aloud, his voice shaking. "The spirits demand a sacrifice. Only through blood can the curse be lifted." "No," Laura said, her voice breaking. "We can't do this." "We don't have a choice," David said, his voice firm. "If we don't, the darkness will consume us." "I'll do it," Mike said, surprising everyone. "I'll be the sacrifice." "No, Mike," Emily said, her voice filled with tears. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Mike said, his voice firm. "I'll do it. I'll be the sacrifice." Chapter 11: The Dark Ritual. They returned to the house, their hearts heavy with sorrow. In the hidden room, they prepared for the ritual, drawing the symbols and lighting the candles as described in the diary. Mike stood in the center of the summoning circle, his face pale but determined. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice shaking. David began the incantations, his voice trembling. The air grew colder, and the shadows around them seemed to close in. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a deafening roar. As they chanted, Mike's body began to convulse. Blood flowed from invisible wounds, soaking the floor beneath him. He let out a final, agonized scream before collapsing to the ground, his body lifeless. The whispers stopped, and the air grew warmer. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and calm. "We did it," David said, his voice filled with relief and sorrow. "We stopped the curse." Chapter 12: The Aftermath. They carried Mike's body out of the house, their hearts heavy with grief. They knew they had lost a friend, but his sacrifice had saved them all. As they walked back to town, the events of the past few days weighed heavily on their minds. They knew they would never be the same, but they were determined to move on with their lives. In the weeks that followed, they tried to return to normalcy. But the memory of Mike's sacrifice and the horrors they had witnessed stayed with them. They were plagued by nightmares and visions, and the memory of the whispers lingered in the back of their minds. "We need to tell someone," Emily said one day, her voice filled with determination. "We need to make sure no one else goes into that house." David nodded, his eyes filled with resolve. "We will. We'll make sure everyone knows what happened." Chapter 13: The Investigation. They went to the police, telling them everything that had happened in the house. The police were skeptical at first, but the evidence they provided was too compelling to ignore. They launched an investigation, uncovering the dark history of the house and the curse that had plagued the Harrow family. The house was sealed off, declared a danger to the public. The town was filled with whispers and rumors, but the truth of what had happened remained a closely guarded secret. David, Laura, and Emily tried to move on with their lives, but the events of that night stayed with them. They knew they had done the right thing, but the memory of Mike's sacrifice would haunt them forever. Chapter 14. The Return. Years later, David returned to Harrow House, unable to shake the memories of that night. The house was in ruins, the walls crumbling, and the roof caved in. But the air was still thick with the scent of decay, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. He stood at the edge of the property, his heart heavy with sorrow. He knew he could never forget what had happened, but he also knew he had to face his fears. As he stood there, he heard a faint whisper, a voice calling his name. Chapter 15. The Whisper's Return. David's heart pounded as he heard his name being whispered, echoing through the dilapidated remains of Harrow House. He knew it wasn't his imagination. The house, or whatever dwelled within it, remembered him. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, pushing open the rusted gate once more. The familiar creak sent chills down his spine. He approached the front door, which hung ajar, as if inviting him inside. David hesitated for a moment before entering. The foyer was much as he remembered it, though more decayed and covered in a thicker layer of dust. The oppressive silence was replaced by the soft, haunting whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. "Why am I here?" he whispered to himself, trying to summon the courage to continue. He knew the answer. He needed closure. He needed to understand what had truly happened that night, and why the whispers had returned after all these years. Chapter 16. Reopening Old Wounds. David retraced his steps from that fateful night, moving through the rooms with a mixture of dread and determination. Every corner held a memory. Every shadow seemed to hide a ghost. He found himself in the library, standing before the hidden door that led to the basement. He pushed it open and descended the creaky stairs. The basement was even colder than he remembered, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The locked door they had never managed to open loomed before him. To his surprise, it was now slightly ajar. David's flashlight flickered as he pushed the door open, revealing a small, dank room filled with more occult symbols. In the center was an old, dusty altar covered in dried blood. He stepped inside, his breath forming visible puffs in the cold air. On the altar lay another diary, similar to Elizabeth Harrow's, but seemingly newer. With trembling hands, David opened the diary. The handwriting was different, more frantic and erratic. "Dear Diary," he reads aloud, "the darkness has never truly left. It waits, hungry and patient. It demands more sacrifices. It will never be sated." David's heart raced. The entries continued, detailing the desperate attempts of another resident to appease the darkness, to keep the whispers at bay. Chapter 17. The Confrontation. As David reads, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The air grew colder, and shadows seemed to gather around him, pressing in from all sides. "You cannot escape," the whispers said, their voices blending into a single, haunting chorus. "You belong to us." David looked around, his flashlight flickering. He felt a cold hand on his shoulder and spun around, but there was no one there. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with malevolent energy. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing through the basement. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. It was Elizabeth Harrow, or what remained of her. Her eyes were hollow, her face twisted in eternal torment. "You must end this," she said, her voice a ghostly whisper. "The darkness must be appeased." "How?" David asked, his voice trembling. "What do I need to do?" Elizabeth's form flickered, and she pointed to the altar. "A final sacrifice," she said. "Only then will the darkness be banished." Chapter 18. The Final Decision. David's mind raced. He had come here seeking closure, but he never expected this. The idea of another sacrifice, of spilling more blood, was abhorrent to him. But if it was the only way to end the curse, to stop the darkness once and for all— "No," he said, shaking his head. "There has to be another way." "The darkness will consume you," Elizabeth warned, her form growing fainter. "It will consume everyone you love." David felt the weight of her words, the hopelessness of the situation pressing down on him. He thought of Mike, of the friends he had lost, and the lives that could be saved if he ended this now. With a heavy heart, he stepped towards the altar. He felt a cold, sharp pain in his chest and looked down to see a knife in his hand, the blade slick with his own blood. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his vision growing dark. "I'm so sorry." Chapter 19. The darkness lifts. As David collapsed, the whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices filling his mind. He felt himself slipping away, the cold darkness closing in. But then, something changed. The whispers began to fade, replaced by a soft, soothing silence. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew warmer. The shadows retreated, and the room filled with a soft, golden light. David felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew he had done it. He had ended the curse, banished the darkness. In his final moments, he saw Elizabeth Harrow standing before him, her face no longer twisted in torment. She smiled, a look of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have freed us all." David closed his eyes, a sense of calm and relief washing over him. He had done it. He had saved them all. Chapter 20. The Legacy. The townsfolk found David's body the next day, lying in the basement of Harrow House. The house was finally at peace, the darkness lifted, the whispers silenced. David was remembered as a hero, the one who had ended the curse that had plagued Harrow House for generations. His sacrifice was honored, his story told and retold as a warning to those who might dare to disturb the darkness. Harrow House was eventually demolished, the land cleansed and blessed. A small memorial was erected in David's honor, a testament to his bravery and sacrifice. And so, the whispers of Harrow House faded into legend, a dark chapter closed, never to be reopened. But the memory of that night, of the darkness and the sacrifice, would live on, a reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown, and the price one might pay to cross it.